We were talking before about the light in Australia and how the sound is different and how people occupy space differently. And we do. I've always been interested in the Aboriginalisation of Australian English, and which is, and Australian English is superficially Irish, Cockney, as opposed to American English, which is clearly German, and which means, of course, that the Americans don't know how to swear. Is the most important part of that. And Australian English has lots of diphthongs and nasalizations, which gives people the ability to stand further away or to speak more quietly. So jokes are much more about understatement, which means, of course, they don't translate particularly well. In terms of diphthongs, I think that the formal classical European notions of pure vowels and pure tones, and why singing was always done in Latin, and then or in Italian. They only learned to sing in French much later. German, you had the umlauts. French, you had nasals, which is not particularly. And English is not a language which makes musical sense in that European, well-formed notion of music until Schoenberg or Stravinsky. But it's that whole 12-tone thing. And so Joyce is. I always find Joyce so sort of musically mid-19th century lyric tenor. The Australian English, diphthongs. Yeah. In terms of digitals, sorry. But maybe the digital is an interesting way to get into the issue. It's I was a librarian for this guy when I was an adolescent who did all this stuff who got me into psycholinguistics, and then he did various other things, and then made a book on the title of which was "Your Body Doesn't Lie," which was one of those position zeros against the CD, and the whole digital flicker issue, and there are sounds that operate between E and F in a tempered scale. I was really so excited when we had a sampling rate of 192, which was quasi-analog. It was like a great sound, and at exactly that moment in history, we got the MP3, and the MP3 is interesting because it adds noise to the signal. So, and noise means that you make the signal becomes more intimate. So it foregrounds the voice. And in the same sense, it's like the whole issue of phone sex or radio. Why it was that radio was of a limited bandwidth in the 1930s when they made all the legislations about how good the sound could possibly be on radio, and because they were concerned about putting live musicians out of work. But so, and then this all becomes this sort of issue about technical determinism and whether, for example, we would have jazz without the 78, and jazz is the music which sounds good on a 78. Bartok doesn't sound any good on a 78. It needs to be trumpet, it needs rhythm section, it needs saxophone's okay, and cymbals. These are the things that record well on a 78. So, and so that it's like you have the intimate relationship between rock and roll and the transistor radio. It sounds good on a 3-inch speaker. In terms of, the issue of writing in the digital thing, that goes to how it was that I was interested to the technology of questions website thing, which is sort of the anti Google, and that Google became the default definition of what was digital, and that the issue with Google is that the answer is already there, and your job is to interrogate the technology such that to understand what the right question is, and then you would get the answer. Which is like saying that an Apple computer is completely intuitive if you know how to use it. So it's patent nonsense. And I'm much more interested in questions than I am in answers. So the questions are the footnote being that questions are portable and answers are not. So how to make so digital seems like the obvious way of making quite a number of texts, any number of texts, easily available simultaneously, and such that you could then articulate a route through them, which could be a random walk, could be any sort of walk through them, or that you could interrogate them all simultaneously to find out what it was that the question that you were trying to articulate. And we were talking earlier about the nature of libraries and associative logics, and so I'm a fan of I'm a fan of theology because theology is interested in talking about that which we have admitted that we don't know how to talk about. And that we have ways of reading religious texts which are made up of which is a sort of a form of frottage, formalized frottage versions of, and so that the commentaries, the Talmudic commentaries, refer to a whole bunch of other possible texts, which is presumably part of that whole issue of how the alphabet was conceived as a code, and how we do this how to do this in speech seems to me to be the interesting question. In terms of going back to spaces to the question of diphthongs and where do they associate in the vowel tree, or we mentioned before that whole thing about sort of historical Marxist linguistics, from materialist linguistics from the 1950s, about the history of various consonants and vowel sounds, and that they articulate that they're technologies which are requisitive, so that the L, which the Roman love letter, which doesn't appear before, was logically dependent on the idea of weaving. That there is a level of articulation which is required such that you could conceive of an L. How to make a library of speech such that these sounds are accessible as readily accessible as printed text or digital. Text which you read. I think this is where we end up with in terms of computing, but that is okay. There are several things in play. One of which is the issue of associative logics, and so Ranganathan. So who wants to. So the alternative to the Dewey Decimal System, so where you file, so yellow associates to yellow peril, and associates to chrome, associates to jaundice, associates to yellow belly, associates to the Chinese diaspora, whatever it is, and which of course you can't do in the Dewey Decimal System. And that we do something like that in speech. We were talking about Brandon LaBelle's thing before. I'm more inclined to think in terms of Wolfram, which is sort of the aggressively local. The decision of what the word might be is a very local decision somewhere in the mouth, in the orientation of the tongue to the palate and the teeth, and that semantics is generated from the mouth out. Sense is this moment, therefore sense is this moment of charity which is bestowed by the listener. And so I'm interested, which is why I'm interested in these liminal spaces of things that are not yet sense or are somehow incomplete, or that you would like to think make sense, but you're not exactly sure how to resolve them. And so the issue in computing, which is what I take digital to mean here, as opposed to digital as in fingers. The fingers dialectic thing is that whole Robert Graves' White Goddess finger alphabets digression, which I don't want to get into here. I think computationally, I think we discover, I think we're in the midst of discovering, so when we go from silicon to photons, and their on-off state, I think logically, I think the place to go after that is sound, because we get the number of variables, of course, increases, and so it's much denser as a medium, which then I think we just said about, essentially we reinvent speech or rediscover speech just to find out what the fuck we've been saying all of this time. What did I mean when I said that? Which is Joyce's thing of, I don't know what I say. I don't know what I mean until I say it. And so there is something in here which is to do with the logic of the tip of the tongue. And if you put your finger any further down your throat, you throw up. So I think those are the issues. How we would make a computational system which is made of moments of speech, and what sort of technology we would embed this in, other than humans, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what the point of trying to do it in other than humans might be. But I think that's the radical reinvention of speech. I think that's where, which I take to be the object of poetry. I think brittle is. I think of brittle. We were talking earlier about what's interesting about microphones, and it's to try to capture the voice quite early in the piece before it becomes synthesized by the environment, and that the environment is something that treats the voice ecologically quite reasonably, and homogenizes it a lot and behaves it a lot. And so the further into the mouth that we go, the more brittle the signal is, the more vulnerable it is, and I think therefore has more of an opportunity to be I'm tossing up between using the word wrong and being dangerous. And I'll settle for both of them, I think. But yeah. Which is, I think, the same thing here, actually, about micropolitics and collective psychology. The Oedipus story is really interesting because I don't think it's particularly interesting, and it's neither here nor there that he fucks his mum or doesn't fuck his mum or whatever it is, or kills his dad. I think what's interesting about the Oedipus story is that he knows. We all know. That is, the important thing to the whole thing is that you know the story. The important thing is he was told what was going to happen. So it's about what's the role of knowledge? Does it make any fucking difference? And how do you avoid? What's the relationship between knowledge and trauma? How do you avoid knowledge? And what do we mean? How, and if we were to define knowledge, how would we think about it in other than terms of agreement? This is what we agree to. And that the problem with Trump, the expression of Trump, is that Trump is the expression of agreement. That is, that there is no negation. So if Trump is the expression of the internet, then, and the internet is something which doesn't allow negation, doesn't allow disagreement, doesn't allow dialectics, doesn't allow politics. Politics is something which is which in this environment now can only be expressed locally, and then the question is, for me anyway, whether we're all students of Christian Wolff, essentially, in terms of politics is what we do when we do music. Then the question is, for me, is it logical to do? How would I go about making the distinction between politics and music? And that's just, there is that music which treats me as a decoration, for which my listening is completely redundant, or it's a form of jewellery that worn by the performer or the composer or something. So I'm important in that sort of postmodernist David Bowie sense of I have to put down my $5 to buy the fucking album. But that's the extent of my relevance, as opposed to there is a music that needs me, that needs my engagement in some sense, that would be either immature or incomplete without me. It may still be immature and incomplete with me, but and that's how I think about language. So I'm anxious about the expressions of well-formedness. I get anxious when I know what the form is, because then we're stuck with the issue of reproduction, and I think it's more interesting than that. I would like to think it's more interesting than that. Does that make sense?